My name is Cristina Stancho. I'm a professor of English here at VCU, and I'm the current director of VCU's Humanities Research Center. I'm very happy to be here today to introduce a book we've been looking forward to reading and talking about. Our colleague in history, Daniel Morales, is Between Here and There, Creating the Political Economy of Mexican Migration, which came out from Oxford University Press just a few months ago. Before we get to those introductions, I'd like to express thanks to all of you for taking the time, and also to our staff members, Ronnie Sisavath and Ellie Musgrave, for their support with organizing and promoting this event. And as many of you probably know by now, this is Rani's almost last week. Last week, I think, is March 14th, and we are extremely grateful and humbled by everything she's done for the center, and thank her very much. And if you'd like to do so, please express your feelings in an email. I'm sure she'll appreciate it. For those of you who are new to this series, Meet VCU Authors, we invite faculty, students, and members of the Richmond community to meet VCU authors as they talk about their recent publications and answer questions about their work, and also as we celebrate works, because let's face it, books and especially monographs take a really long time to complete. Our virtual events follow a more or less similar format, and I'll briefly introduce Daniel, who will take about 40 minutes to talk about his book, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A. Please use either the Q&A or the chat function to write your questions. Now, on to the good part. It is my pleasure to introduce our colleague, Dr. Daniel Morales, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History here at VCU, and one of the two co-directors of our Migration Studies Lab, where he leads the Latino Virginia project that I know many of you know about. And I hope that during Q&A, Dr. Morales will be happy to take any questions about his work at the lab also, if such questions emerge. Dr. Morales hails from Southern California, and he earned his PhD in history from Columbia in 2016 and his BA from the University of Chicago in 2008. His research focuses on the social and economic history of migration between Latin America and the United States. Here at VCU, he teaches courses such as digital history, immigration to the United States, and Latinos in the United States. He's the recipient of several recent national awards, including a Career Enhancement Fellowship from the formerly known Woodrow Wilson Foundation, 2021-2022, and the Visiting Scholar Award from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, 2016-17. When he doesn't teach, lead a lab, raise his family, or do this amazing scholarship, Dr. Morales also writes and speaks on immigration-related issues inside and outside of academia, including for venues such as NPR and PBS. Dr. Morales recently published his first monograph, as I mentioned, Between Here and There, Creating the Political Economy of Mexican Migration, with Oxford University Press, which is the first book to investigate the creation of modern U.S.-Mexico migration patterns, narrated from multiple sites on those borders and interior states. Dr. Morales, congratulations on this huge accomplishment, and many thanks for being here with us today for Meet VCU Authors.
All right. Well, thank you, Christina. Thank you for the invitation to talk today, and for Ronnie, Ellie, and everyone else at the Humanities Research Center that makes these talks possible. And so this is what I'm here to talk about. This book took a great many years together. All right, let me share my screen. Okay. My book, Between Here and There, Creating the Political Economy of Mexican Migration, focuses specifically on the origins and processes of mass migration between Mexico and the US. In the spring of 1931, the family of Maria Gonzalez, who was 11 years old, faced a difficult choice. They had crossed into the United States during the Mexican Revolution 15 years before. The father, Felix Gonzalez, had become a miner in Miami, Arizona, where his daughter was born, and he had taken part in Industrial Worker of the World, IWW, led union drives that were violently suppressed at the end of World War I. After the defeat of the unionization movement, Felix took a job at the Santa Fe Railroad, and he moved the family to California following the jobs there, and then to El Monte in Los Angeles County, where he settled the family. He and his wife, Maria de la Cruz, by then had two US-born daughters, Guadalupe and Mariana, that were born back in Arizona. When the Great Depression hit, Felix was the only wage earner, and he found himself out of a job. And he was caught up in the repatriation drives of Southern California. They needed aid, and the county aid office effectively said, no, we're going to cut off your aid, but we're going to give you these rail passes to go to Mexico, and you can go to Mexico. Felix decided it would be best to return to the family to their hometown of La Barca, Jalisco, where his parents and other distant relatives still lived. However, his US-born daughters didn't want to go, especially 16-year-old Guadalupe, who was in a relationship with a young man in El Monte. Guadalupe pressed and pressed, and she convinced her parents to let her stay. And so she did. She married at 16 and settled in El Monte, California. 11-year-old Mariana, however, left. She, along with many others, were deported, and she went with her parents to live in rural Jalisco. The father had imagined that this family could settle permanently, but he and Maria de la Cruz were unable to secure their own land, and instead they became itinerant farm workers on apricot plantations. After a few years, Felix fell ill and died, leaving Maria to take care of Mariana. Their lack of resources contributed to Mariana's marriage at about 15 to Fermin Morales, an artisan metal worker who made gear for charros, cowboy basically gear, in Jalisco. She gave birth to 3 children, on the way to 9 children, and seemed to have settled permanently in La Barca, Jalisco. However, she voiced her desire to return to the US, insisting to anyone who cared to listen that she was an American and should never have been sent to Mexico. Migrants like Mariana were caught on a bind. A natural-born US citizen, she nevertheless found herself repatriated, a landless farm worker in Jalisco, enmeshed in a community that was suspicious of her poor Spanish and that wanted her to assume the role of a traditional rural Mexican wife. In Mexico, she was seen as an outsider, along with hundreds of thousands who had returned in those years. Yet, at the same time, in the United States, she and many other Mexican migrants in general, and even Mexican Americans, were not seen as truly American, and they were seen as deportable, not the people we are trying to protect. Mariana and her family were among those who were expelled from the United States in what was the first mass deportation in American history. In 3 years, about 450,000 people were repatriated to Mexico. At least 40% of them were US citizens. This book is about the origins of mass migration between Mexico and the US, and looks at the period between 1910 and 1940, that is from the Mexican Revolution to World War II. And it reconsiders Mexican-American community formation within the broader context of ongoing circular migration between these two places and within the United States. The latter dynamic has been least recognized or understood. Permanently settled migrants were a minority and most were constantly moved, and they trekked around the country following work in agriculture, mining, and industry. And they voted with their feet to resist local vagrancy laws and labor agents who tried to control them. And they tried to organize mutual aid organizations and sometimes unions, and they sought to return to their hometowns. Circular migration and settlement then were not successive phases, but always concurrent and dynamically related. And this best can be seen by going back and forth between the two countries. These close connections between here and there, that is, entre aquí y allá, do not appear in most American histories, which focus on the United States. And there is a disconnect between the history of migration and the history of communities, and the ways in which people who actually lived through all this actually described their own experiences. Migrants tend to stress the opportunities they face, often more than discrimination, And they usually continue to see themselves as belonging to their hometowns, and they didn't see their migration as separating themselves from those they had left behind. These were an example of the laws that were set up against Mexican migration in these years. These are the numbers that I'm talking about. In 1900, fewer than 3,000 people migrated between Mexico and the US. By 1910, tens of thousands traveled in both countries each year. The Mexican Revolution drove migration out from central Mexico on a scale never seen. Some 500,000 people traveled north, the bulk of them into Texas. By 1930, nearly 1 million Mexican-born people were living in the United States. Nearly 1 in 10, or basically 10% of all of Mexico's population, and about 15% of Mexico's workforce. This is the start of the patterns that continue till today. The industrialization of Mexico and the American West, the violence of the revolution and the subsequent Cristero War, and displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. Yet while these big events framed migration, they don't explain a lot of the particulars, why people kept migrating, or the variations you see in different communities, or why people went to the particular locations in the United States that they did. American companies imported their industrial working class, mainly from Europe and increasingly Asian and Latin America in these years. Anti-immigrant restrictions, back over here, that were passed in 1917 when the US entered World War II, and the influx of European workers. Concurrently, the Secretary of Labor passed a series of exceptions to immigration restrictions, notably a ban on foreign contract labor. Under this program, about 72,000 Mexicans crossed into the US in a 3-year period. See if I have it. No, I don't. Okay. After 1921, the Act and the landmark 1924 Johnson-Reed Act severely restricted migration from Europe and Asia, ending an era when these regions were a major source of labor. Yet the law exempted the Western Hemisphere, in particular Mexico, from these quotas. Through the 1920s, the US economy continued to grow and demand continued to grow. Basically, this is what fueled the explosion in migration from Mexico, this demand to replace the end of European and Asian migration. Despite being the largest migratory movement between two states in modern history, the origins of Mexican migration have not been a major research topic. In order to study the formation, operation, and reproduction of these migrant patterns, it was necessary to create new data. Making use of the United States Census and Mexican Census, I followed patterns among 2,500 families and to see where them and all their descendants went from about 1910 through about 1950. I paired this with GIS, geographic information systems, to show the extent of spatial mobility across physical space. This is a map of what that research entailed. And this is the migrations that defined this era. Not a single migration or even a type of migration, but often multiple forms, with local and regional circuits here, here, and here, overlapping with national circuits like the ones you see here and here and here and down, as well as transnational circuits, the big ones going back and forth between central Mexico and the Midwest or central Mexico and California. Circular migration was and is far more extensive than scholars have accounted for. More than 50% of the migrants went back to Mexico at some point before 1930. The trend was strongest in the Midwest and California, which received the bulk of their people from central Mexico. But internal migration was just as common. Mexicans circulated within the US, not only within circuits, but also across regions and across industries. It was common for an agricultural worker in Texas to become a beet worker in Michigan or a factory worker in California. This type of labor was not only common, but constituted a distinct economy. Migrants made the mining, cotton, vegetable, sugar beet, railroad, and steel industries possible in the United States. Yet, through this era, the workers had precarious existence with few legal protections or avenues for socioeconomic advancement. Political and business elites recruited migrants, and they wanted effectively government-subsidized, low-wage industrial workers, often to transform the American West. Yet these workers were not deterred. Chapters 2 and 3 demonstrate how migrants navigated their transnational lives, finding ways to circumvent and resist controls at the border and the interior. Migrants pushed back against those who sought to control them. What emerges is a story of local negotiations as governments, businesses, labor contractors, various other intermediaries contended with the interests and actions of migrants. While most of the resistance was quite small, quitting, migrating, seeking out other opportunities, there was also quite a lot of overlap with other forms of resistance. Labor organizing and strikes were highly public reactions to exploited conditions. Perhaps not the most common ones, but they were not rare either. During the 1910s, Mexicans joined other migrants in organizing in the fields of the American West. Equally important, labor organizing and labor organization acted as vehicles of cross-border politics and networks. Interpersonal networks operate in conjunction with a world of organizations that sought to advance interests in the U.S. Some of these networks, like the Partido Liberal Mexicano, established successful cross-border raids, inspired the plan the San Diego Revolt in South Texas, and provided the background for strikes in the 1910s. Others, such as the world of business, newspapers, mutualistas, businesses, and consulates, were critical in the formation of a cultural and political community that was known at the time as Mexico de Afuera, that pushed for rights within U.S. legal frameworks, as opposed to more violent ends. For many, migration itself became a strategy, as people built transnational lives to deal with their circumstances, often finding ways to circumvent controls. In both countries, I used qualitative sources that ranged from oral histories, interviews, letters, ballads, fiction, newspapers, and other writings. These are examples of letters that Mexicans wrote about their migration journeys. These sources showed the ways people created transnational communities. As a result, the study takes a micro-macro approach, moving between specific towns in the larger regions. This is a map of Mexico. There are lines indicating one of the major railroad routes that people used to go north. In a close examination of a series of small towns in the heart of migrant-sending central Mexico, I demonstrate that town-based interpersonal networks formed the engine that sustained large-scale migration, providing the information, transportation, and capital that people needed to move north. This is the state of Guanajuato. Here, the population growth, combined with the Mexican Revolution and the Cristero War, drove more than 100,000 people from the state between 1910 and 1920, and another 130,000 between 1920 and 1930. This here on the sea is one of these towns, San Francisco de Rincon, cabecera, which is to say a main county seat. Here, information passed from person to person, not only family members and close friends, but distant acquaintances and often people they had not met personally. And this became self-reinforcing enough to continue long past the original reason that people wanted to leave. People travel in groups with those that they knew, with those who had made the journey before. It was through this expansion of the social imaginary that migration became possible for many young people. It was seen more and more as a normal thing to do. Migration began to form its own social and cultural economy in these small towns that sustained many local communities, especially rural farm villages, while simultaneously tying them to circular migration from the US. From this point forward, migration was an important component of the rural economy, one that supported rather than competed with rural landowning. In studying the places where migration became deeply ingrained in the local culture, it was possible to see the past created by early migrants. Mass migration on the ground looks not so large, but rather tiny, like many small micro-migrations between communities in the US and sending communities and daughter communities in the US. As migrants went north, they sent back information, and when they returned, they brought back that experience. The experience combined with money raised from others in the community made it easier for those to go north, or to make the decision to do so. These networks of people and information helped migrants leave and navigate the risk of the journey. And these reinforcing logics basically created an economy that affected these regions as much as the Mexican-American communities in the US. Migration then was not an act of leaving the community, and instead was becoming deeply embedded in the social fabric of the places people were coming from. In the 1920s, on both sides of the border, The state acted to control migrants, shaping their lives through law, policing, and violence. In Mexico, public discourse and the government increasingly turned against migration. The 1917 Constitution limited migration to those who had labor contracts, and President Obregón devoted hundreds of thousands of people to repatriating about 150,000 people back to Mexico, and tried to offer free agricultural land to those who were willing to relocate, clear, and work the claim. In 1926, an immigration law was passed in Mexico, and the government went further. It created a migration police force to go along with the United States Border Patrol and to stop uncontrolled migration. And they established basically a large federal presence to try to stop people from leaving. During this time, however, the Cristero War, which was an armed conflict between the Mexican government and Catholic rebels that raged from 1926 through the 1930s, and it drove tens of thousands of people from their homes and encouraged local governments to promote migration as an alternative to land redistribution. As a result, hundreds of thousands of people continued to leave these areas, and land was not redistributed in the Altos of Jalisco. By 1930, nearly 1 million people lived in the US. Back in the United States, public opinion turned sharply against Mexican migration. The widespread violence of the 1910s, both state and private, served to establish limits on Mexican rights and labeled them politically and racially as non-white and outside the polity and perhaps a threat. Scholars and intellectuals in the US at the time sought to understand and explain Mexican migrants through a European immigrant framework oriented towards assimilation. Experts in the media and politicians argue over what they called the Mexican problem, and over whether to ban Mexicans from migrating to the United States at all. After a series of new laws were passed, the mostly open borders and welcoming legal system of the early 1920s was replaced by physical markers of exclusion. Small ports were replaced by walls, fencing, the Border Patrol, and raids. The Border Patrol was established in 1924, as was the modern system of walls, systems, and checks, as well as the passport system. The criminalization of undocumented entry was added in 1929 that was almost entirely targeted against Mexicans, as well as a web of state laws that was created in response to this fear. These series of laws cut off most legal avenues for migration. These moves helped create the idea of the modern nation state, and even made it possible to even imagine a border or separation across the borderlands, and even the existence of a legal alien, a phrase that came into use during these years. Seen as others or birds of passage or criminals, Mexicans then became an obvious target for deportation after the economy hit a crisis in 1929. Layered over racial divides, this distinction made it possible to conceive of, or even imagine, that you could basically deport a mass part of the people in the United States. The second half of this book focuses on the consequences of this, right? The largest mass deportation campaign in American history up to that point. In the 1930s, conditions deteriorated, and hundreds of thousands of people went to Mexico. And I basically follow these people, like what happened to the people who were subjected to this? Back in Mexico, the government has supported return, often with funds, planning, and a rhetoric. Celebrities such as Diego Rivera and every president, from Calles to Cardenas, called on people to return to rebuild the nation. The Great Depression put this official policy to the test as returning migrants created a series of crises within Mexico over land redistribution. Most of the agricultural colonies the Mexican government created for U.S. repatriates failed within a few years. Faced with dire economic circumstances and receiving little support, these returnees fell back on the aid of local communities. Returnees' relationship with social and state structures such as land redistribution, state governments, land reform movements, back to what I was referring to earlier, shaped their experiences of return. With support from their hometowns, adjustment was difficult but not impossible, especially for those who were younger. Hometowns provided structural support for resettlement and reassimilation, but many people were left out of these, especially children, especially those who were U.S. citizens. These communities also incorporated them into a land reform movement. The return of hundreds of thousands of people into rural Mexico greatly increased pressures of land. Effectively, this book created a series of political crises where people demand for land spiked, and the specific communities that saw the largest number of people return to them had the largest number of land redistributions in these years, in the years of the Cardenas years. Usually thought the Cardenas administration in Mexico is usually thought of as having done a lot of these redistributions because of pressure from landed villagers. But another part of this, and the part that's often forgotten, is that it was the returnees that were creating the particular pressure in the highest areas, and really causing a lot of this in Jalisco and in some of the other states in central Mexico. However, even after mass land reform, this did not solve the causes of migration. And in the 1930s, a second generation from central Mexico turned to migration as an economic survival strategy. By the 1940s, a mixed agrarian remittance economy was taking shape that would drive migration through the rest of the century. Back in the United States, Mexican organizations, which is to say those who didn't leave, those who stayed behind, were starting to articulate a claims to rights based on U.S. citizenship. It's been forgotten that the years 1933 through 1940 witnessed the largest organizing activity among migrant farm workers before the Chicano movement of the 1960s. The expansive political visions of these Mexicans continues to reverberate decades later. Migrant farm workers joined middle-class or Mexican Americans in building on the long history of organizations to promote different political visions. Some call Mexico de afuera and the Mexican Revolution to protect their rights. Others turned to the United States and American civil rights protections, while still others drew on radical traditions, forming anarchist and communist unions, which organized dozens of union strikes across the country within a matter of months. The 1933 Los Angeles berry strike and the subsequent San Joaquin Valley cotton strike were the largest agricultural strikes the nation had ever seen. These strikes were organized by migrant farm workers as the circulation of ideas followed from the circulation of people. And this unionizing activity continued into the field and into the canneries, which were dominated by immigrant women. Some radical organizations in these years pushed back even against the idea of citizenship or nation state. Union leaders such as Emma Tecayuca and Luisa Moreno articulated visions of the polity and people of the borderlands that didn't depend on one state or another, but were based instead on labor, on common peoplehood, and their history. However, their trans-border visions were violently suppressed. Both were jailed, and their respective unions collapsed, and Luisa Moreno was deported. In this era, the rise of mass migration forced intellectuals, migrants, and governments to think about migrants' place in society, but their discourse always lacked practice. That also was true of migrants themselves. In interviews and letters, nearly all migrants saw themselves primarily as Mexican, even as they built a world of transnational practices that challenged that identity. Most could not conceive of themselves as anything else. They were part of the community where they had left. However, they did use these frameworks to organize for material change and for a broader idea of what was Mexican. Those who returned used expansive to lay claim to citizenship and land in Mexico. And those in the US joined efforts usually for better pay, working conditions, and rights in a New Deal state. So going from radical organizations to CIO-led organizations, and then eventually more mainstream organizations, creating a base for later organizing. These migrants in the 1930s fought for recognition in both societies. When World War II began, both governments saw an opportunity to realize long-sought reforms in migration, especially controlling migration, which they hadn't before, and achieving labor rights on the Mexican end, but also labor security, which is to say a steady stream of workers for American employers for the U.S. On the U.S. end. The formal mechanism of migration was now controlled by the United States government, ending an era when migration was almost entirely social phenomenon. From 1942 to its conclusion in 1964, about 4.6 million Mexicans participated. The Bracero Program formalized and gave state sanction to the political economy of migrant labor, and it was built on the experiences of these earlier migrants. In theory, The Bracero Program was separate from previous labor arrangements, but in practice, it operated along the same local and transnational migrant networks that had been established decades before. Workers and communities fought to pursue opportunities and realistic options available to them, be it bracero, undocumented worker, and found ways to expand the realm of possibilities. It was because migrants' strong ties to the community that even when it was co-opted by government bureaucracies, they continued to come overwhelmingly from the same small rural towns that had previously been sending every people. In this sense, migrants were able to build social structures outside of the state. The result is a book that brings Latino and borderland history into dialogue with the literature on global migration. My research shows the extent to which Mexican migration was subject to the same forces that drove European and Asian migration across the world. The second industrialization of the late 19th and early 20th century precipitated the largest migrations in human history up to that time. People moved from the periphery to the core of the new capitalist order. Yet they largely did so along political lines, migrating from the far reaches of colonial empires to the metropoles. Like Asian and European immigrants, Mexicans relied on interpersonal networks to guide their long journeys, even as the political situation was unique to each group. Mexicans circulated back home, like their contemporaries, creating transnational communities. Yet, unlike these groups, the proximity of Mexico to the US meant the circulation of ideas, remittances, and people across the space of the borderlands was on a completely different scale. This book explores how migration became deeply embedded in the reality of millions of people on both sides of the border, as well as an entrenched part of the social and political structures of both countries. Today, more than 40 million Mexican and Mexican Americans live in the US. 1 in 5 Americans is Latino. The movement between Mexican and the United States is the largest between the two states in modern history. And both societies have been changed by this reality, and to a large extent, the politics of both countries is driven by this reality. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you all for all the questions that have already arrived in our Q&A. Before we get started, Danielle, congratulations again. And tell us a little bit about this title, Between Here and There. I loved hearing, about the wealth of materials you've used, archival, you mentioned oral histories. And I think my favorite was ballads. I would love to hear more about that. But tell us a little bit about the title and the sources that led to this book.
Um, for a very long time, the title of the book was Entre aquí y allá, which is literally between here and there, but in Spanish.
Uh,
The um, the original book actually contained quite a bit more Spanish than the final version did, but they
hmm.
moved a lot as it moved to publication. It became one of the casualties that goes along with cutting pages and trying to fit it into like the standard text. I think the original thing I turned in was 450 pages, so I was like, okay, a bit too much. And so we changed it to English, and that's where the title of the book came. So it's a translation of Entre aquí.
Uh-huh. Was the publisher invested in this anglicized title more so than
Yeah,
the
because they
Spanish?
wanted this. The idea here is that it's mostly an American audience that would be interested in this, and so they wanted it to read well in English and to
Uh-huh.
not need
Interesting.
as much Spanish as they originally did.
Interesting. Well, thank you for
All the ballads
sharing.
are translated as well.
Absolutely. Well, while our colleagues continue to pose their questions here, I will start with the first one from Arya Sharif. We see a lot of discussion about Mexican immigration to the United States. Historically, how has American immigration to Mexico been viewed by Mexicans and the Mexican government? Um, were there ever similar anti-immigration laws? This is actually her second question, so I'll get to her first in a minute.
Mm. Okay, well, it depends on who the migrants are. And in this case, and actually still today, the biggest group of Americans in Mexico are not like what you might see as Anglo Americans, they're Mexican Americans.
Mm.
make up the vast majority of the Americans in Mexico. In this era, this was the first time Mexico had really faced this situation before, where you had lots of people who had migrated to the US, and now you have this mass deportation campaign, and hundreds of thousands of people return within a few years. Nearly half of them are born in the US, and most of those are children, and you have all these English-speaking children that just flood into Mexico. This was a Mexico that just gone through the Mexican Revolution. Cardenas was the president during these years. There was up top, there was rhetoric for welcoming these people, saying, these are just our lost children. They're not bad. They may not speak Spanish, but they're good. And you want to try to reincorporate them back into the rural communities. On the ground, not so much. There's a whole lot of evidence of people being forced to take off like their American clothing and to switch into Mexican clothing. There's people bullying each other. A lot of people making fun of these people who had these anglicized accents or accents in Spanish or poor Spanish, and a lot of making fun of that. And a lot of these children feeling like, oh, we used to live in Los Angeles or Chicago, and we had technology and we had all these things, and now I'm in a farm, and I've never farmed before, and this feels like the Twilight Zone or something. So there's a lot of alienation in a lot of these accounts, and a lot there. So that's what's going on. More recently, still today, the largest amount of Americans in Mexico are Mexican Americans who go or who be repatriated or who want to go to Mexico. But during the last Trump administration, there were so many deportees from the United States that a lot of American companies created call centers in Mexico to hire them because they spoke really good English. And so they could act as like native English speakers on the phone, even if they're in Mexico City or Guadalajara or one of these other places. More recently, in a lot of news, there's all these ideas of outsiders. There have always been a number of Anglos who went to Mexico. In the era of my book, it's mostly people who are specialists, who are going to under the auspices of a large American company, say like the Guggenheim run the Sarco company, that was the largest mining company in the American West and in Mexico. They would create all these colonies of Americans. And there was, in fact, quite a lot of protest and hatred of these colonies because in these spaces, in these towns, they had political and social rights that normal Mexicans did not, and they got double the pay that anyone else got. And they had their own stores that only they could shop in a part of town that only they could live in. And so that was actually caused quite a lot of friction. It was one of the causes of the Mexican Revolution that did cause a lot of violence against these people, and most of them left after the Mexican Revolution. More recently, I guess there's a lot of internet birds of passage that are going to say Mexico City and often buying up a lot of the nicest parts of Mexico City. And so you now have that going on, where there's a large international population and mostly Americans who are living in Mexico City that is new. That has caused a lot of tensions, but there hasn't been any laws against it as far as I know. Mexico's economy has always been very weak, and so they've always needed a lot of outside capital.
Thank you so much for that. In your presentation, you talked about the change of public opinion against Mexican migration at the beginning of the 20th century. Can you talk about any parallels or what you see happening now? I know this is an unfair question because you're a historian of an earlier era, but this question sort of begs itself, right? The recent um, um, policies or public discourse against Mexican immigration and immigration from other quote unquote undesirable nations. Can you address that as well? Thank you.
I do see quite a bit of parallels, especially through the course of the 1920s. At the beginning of the 1920s, there was this large Mexican migration, but a lot of discussion is when there is a lot of debate about it, is often around, oh, they're really needed. So there's a lot of newspapers that are like, oh, they are very necessary for the industrialization of the American West. Inside the government, the INS people, the people who are actually making the immigration policy, deeply believe that Mexican labor is necessary in the West because otherwise there's literally no one there. Like there's not enough people in the American West in order to farm all this land. And so they feel like they need this labor. And so that keeps going through the 1910s and into the 20s. In 1924, you have this law that ends European migration, as well as creates the Asiatic barred zones that basically ends or bars Asian people as well. But even so, in that law, Mexicans were considered to being banned as well, but they weren't because they were seen as too critical to in the West. But really quickly, after that law passed, all national attention goes to the Mexicans because all of a sudden they're the only group that's still left coming to the U.S. in large numbers. And American companies turn to them even more than before because all of a sudden you have no Europeans that you can give these labors to, and especially in places like the Midwest. So Chicago's population booms, as does Detroit's, and a lot of the Midwestern cities have big booms of Mexican population that you see. And you hadn't seen that before. And so people were like, what the heck is going on? There's like, oh, they weren't banned before. Maybe we should ban it. So you start to see massive pressure in these years to ban them. And so it's actually a major fight in every Congress from 1924 all the way to 1932. The bill almost passes, and then doesn't get passed. Hoover does keep issues of veto threat that eventually kills that bill, but they find other ways to ban Mexican migration. So they basically say, well, if we don't let anyone in through visas, don't give anyone legal passage, that's the way to do it. And so even if they're not banned statutorily, in practice they are banned because they stop giving any legal passage. But the stream doesn't stop; it just becomes undocumented in the late 20s when they tried to do this. But then the depression hits. All of a sudden, they are scapegoats. You start to see Hoover. A lot of the national press is talking about the Mexican threat. They're seeing them as criminals. They're seeing them as people taking the jobs. And all of a sudden, you have 25% unemployment rate. And if you can get rid of these Mexicans, you can give jobs to quote unquote real Americans. And so you start to see this massive push to deport everyone. And so that becomes the repatriation drives of the 30s. And so do I think there's parallels to today? Yes, I think there's quite a few parallels to today. And that's frightening because this is when I first learned about these repatriations, these were seen as like, oh, terrible things that had happened in the past, mass violations of civil liberties. Something like this can never happen today.
Right.
But now we're living through something that's, if not exactly the same, not that different either.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm sure we'll come back to this in future questions. But the next question, also by Arya, is about religion. They say, I know anti-Semitism and an anti-Catholic sentiment were significant factors in the experiences of Jews and Irish Catholics, right, respectively, as well as Islamophobia in much of the more modern immigration rhetoric. How did the religion of Mexican immigrants impact their experiences immigrating to and later their lives in the U.S.? Thank you, Arya.
In that sense, they were not seen as much as outsiders as, say, Muslims are today. They were closer to the European experience of the Irish, and that they joined a lot of the Catholic churches, and they flooded. And, this is a population that's overwhelmingly Catholic. There's still there are Jews and other groups in Mexico, but during this period, the migrants are like 95% Catholics. This was actually seen as a frightening thing. In Los Angeles and other places where there was a lot of migrants, there was a major attempts by the Protestant churches in Los Angeles, in Texas, and in Chicago to Christianize them, but that meant make them into good Protestants, as opposed to bad Catholics. And so there was a lot of Protestant churches that were built in mission churches, often that were built in Catholic neighborhoods in order to try to convert them all. And it's during this period that you start to see Catholic Pentecostalism take off, along with American Pentecostalism around the same time,
Huh.
especially in Southern California after the Azusa revivals there. And so
Mhm.
you have the creation of a Protestant Mexican American community. And that community in this period grows, it might be 15% in these years, but over time it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's now actually a major, it's still not the majority, but there's still like 30 or 40% of
Mhm.
the Mexican Americans in the US are Protestants. And it's a descendant
Huh.
of these communities and these efforts to change them over. Within the Catholic world, they were usually not welcomed. There's a whole lot of accounts of people being basically not welcomed in the Irish church or the Italian churches
Huh.
and having to practice and have their masses, Spanish masses in the basements of churches and
Mhm.
for a first while. And so that led to the creation of a lot of what were known as national Catholic churches, which are basically churches that are built around a single ethnic group. This is how Catholicism worked at the time. So eventually they built a church just for the Mexicans, often a mission church, and then another church. And these were usually called Lady of Guadalupe or something along those lines. And so in every major city where you started to see Mexicans, you started to see Lady of Guadalupe churches pop up because Mexicans were not welcome in the main Catholic churches in these spaces. And so this was a way to kind of segregate them into their own spaces. This is not
Mhm.
as bad as it was for African Americans who had segregated churches and
Right.
their experiences, even Catholic African Americans, their experiences were worse. But this was still, it was along those lines, the idea of creating a separate space so that we never have to deal with them socially as well as in our worship spaces.
Mhm.
Um,
Great.
Oddly enough, this was also a period where a lot of Catholics rallied around the Mexican church because Mexican government that took over in Mexico was stridently anti-Catholic, and they tried to secularize everything. As a result, the Catholic Church basically went to strike and then on war. They declared no masses. So basically, the Catholic Church refused to do any masses in Mexico. And then a series of events led to the Cristero War, which was this large Catholic armed rebellion against the Mexican government that had won the revolution.
Mhm.
And that led to a massive exodus of Catholic priests and bishops. Almost all of them went into the United States. And so they manned all these immigrant churches inside the US. But
Uh-huh.
this also meant that a lot of the higher ups, all the bishops, are in the US. And from the US, they're rallying, they're going around to Catholic churches from all the way to New York,
Mhm.
raising money and saying, Mexican government is anti-Christian, it's a communist front, and you need to give us money in order to support this, in order to keep our struggle going. And so a lot of immigrant communities, Catholic communities, don't like the actual Mexicans in their midst, even as they're giving money for the
Huh.
Catholic cause in Mexico.
Interesting contradiction there. Thank you so much for that response and for the question. Antonio has two questions. I'll go to the first one because we have a few, and I'd like to get to Michael Paulberg's question as well. So Antonio asks, did migration undermine or reinforce the wealth and power of local political bosses or caciques? Is that the right
Yeah.
pronunciation? Caciques in Mexico? And what impact did it have on local politicians in the United States? Thank you, Antonio.
This definitely undermines their authority. So much of the first chapter of the book is actually about this, where there's a lot of people basically being like, okay, uh, traditionally in Mexico, people had their own land, but during the long reign of Porfirio Diaz as dictator of Mexico, he had reoriented the economy towards capitalism and in particular export goods, and that also meant making the farm workers alienated from their land, which is to say, making them from subsistence workers to farm laborers, where they got wages, money
Mhm.
for their labor, as opposed to stuff on their family plots. And so he completely redoes the Mexican government economy. And when they do this, it makes it possible to exploit a lot of farm workers in a way that had never been done before. But they also make it so that, hey, you are offering me, this many pesos. But if I go over there and cross the border, which isn't all that far away, I can triple my wages. So why would I do that? So weirdly enough, their own processes of trying to create a capitalist labor creates the conditions where the capitalist labor was like, well, I can compare my conditions to these other farms down the street, or this railroad a couple of miles away, or this factory, or going to the United States. And a whole lot of them start to pick the United States as this.
Mhm.
A lot of local jefe políticos, as caciques,
Mhm.
traditional leaders,
Mhm.
they depend on controlling the labor and sending it to the local hacendado, the local lord, who controls everything and selling it. And all of a sudden, they can't do that. They try to, when they try to raise people, they might try to raise 100 people, and only 50 people show up. And so they're pretty angry about this, and they try to stop trains going to the United States. They hate the recruiters. There's a whole lot of recruiters that are recruiting to go to the United States, and they try to stop it via main force. A lot of the Mexican police efforts inside of Mexico are aimed at stopping these labor recruiters, and they're aimed at stopping the disinformation from going everywhere. So yes, this undermines their local power. The
Great.
by during the Cristero War and going forward, a lot of local government officials in Mexico City basically see it in their interest to let people go, because the alternative is to pick up arms and to ask for land. And so they see redistribution of land as the thing they absolutely do not want to do. And so
Mhm.
and so a lot of times they'll be like, fine, you can go, you can leave, especially the opposition, especially like Cristeros or the people or the farmless land villagers. Here, we'll give you a bunch of passes to go to the US, or we just
Mhm.
won't stop you from going to the US, because if you stay here, you might cause political trouble and demand land
Uh-huh.
from the hacendados.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And Antonio actually has a comment related to your to the previous question you've answered, which is the Museum of the Knights of Columbus in New Haven has a large part of the regular exhibit dedicated to the Cristero Rebellion and the role of U.S. Catholics in bringing about that armed conflict to an end. Thank you for that, Antonio. I did not know that. I'm not sure about you, Danielle, if you want to address that.
I don't think I did, but it's becoming more of a known thing. When I first started this work, no one had heard of the Cristero War. There was recently a
Oh,
movie about the Cristero War a couple of years ago in the U.S., and there's been a lot more public knowledge about this event, and a lot more open discussion about it in Mexico as well. For a long time, even in Mexico, there was not you couldn't talk about it because the Peru basically tried to suppress discussion of it.
yeah.
But now that it's much more of a thing that people know about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. Thank you to both of you. Moving on to Michael Paulberg's question. Thank you so much for this. He says, today, for the US to deport people, we need a deportation agreement with another country. We have seen some countries in Latin America push back on Trump's deportation, putting these agreements in question. Yet they largely cooperate, including Mexico, taking the role of external deportation agents of the US. Under the last mass deportation, was this done in coordination with the Mexican government, or was this done unilaterally? Thanks so much, Michael, for this great question.
Yeah, this was done. Mexico always played a role in these large deportation efforts. The in the one that I write about in the 1930s, the Mexican government encouraged people to go back to Mexico. Remember, the Mexican government didn't want people to leave. They wanted every they lost 1 million people during the revolution to death. I said demographically, this is something like 3 times worse than the American Civil War was to the U.S. This was an absolute disaster for the Mexican people and the economy of Mexico, and they needed as many people on the farm as they could. After there was so much depopulation, um, and so they want people to return. And, and so they see, and the people who are leaving are usually more educated than the average Mexican and taller than the average Mexican and young men in their prime working years. You're talking about like 16 to like 30. And so like you really, really want these workers back. And so the Mexican government was rhetorically saying come back, but they were also saying we will give you tickets, we will arrange for a lot of this, and you can get land. And so they often promoted repatriation colonies where groups of families were organized in the United States, and they would all go down together and establish farms inside of Mexico. And these were areas, land that had been taken from Hacendado during the Revolution, and they would set up these colonies. Most of these colonies failed within a few years because there was not enough money to keep them going. Some of them survived. The ones that survived were usually cotton plantations along the US border, basically doing the Texas economy, but on the southern side, and usually with irrigation. Irrigation was really quite important because, again, most of Mexico's farms at this time don't use irrigation. They just use water coming from the sky. And that's
Interesting.
and so irrigation was a big deal and required a whole lot of money and capital that usually they didn't have. So only a few colonies were irrigated, so only a few of them succeeded. But back to the question here, that the Mexican government, yeah, is playing a major role, especially in the state of Texas, where the U.S. role is actually not that big. The U.S. role is the U.S. didn't want to spend a lot of money. The state of Texas did not want to spend a lot of money, and so they left it to Mexican organizations to organize a lot of the return to Mexico in the United States and then back in Mexico. So people would get trains in Mexico and back to their hometowns, and there would be some help whenever possible. But yeah, Mexico has always kind of played this role. And so there was also this quite within historians, when they look at the Mexican version of the Border Patrol, their question is like, how much is this an extension of U.S. in law, or is this its own stuff for its own ends? Some historians, Kennedy Hernandez in particular, has argued that it's basically an extension of the U.S. Border Patrol that's now operating all over Mexico with far more authority and ruthlessness and into the interior that even the Border Patrol doesn't do. And so these guys are operating all over Mexico, trying to stop people from leaving their towns. On the other hand, I argue that there's also a lot of local interest involved. A lot of the local businesses, a whole lot of local politicians and state politicians did not want to lose their farm laborers. And so in a lot of, especially if you look at the internal records of these police, that they were responding actually a lot more to internal within Mexico local police or state imperatives than they are to US imperatives.
Yeah, thank you for that. Unfortunately, we're almost at time, but I think we have time for one last question. I'm just going to read one from an anonymous attendee. I don't know, Daniel, if you have a short answer to that, but I really like this question. Were there any American politicians that stood out in your research as being more outspoken about and more compassionate toward Mexican Americans during the repatriation period? Or were outspoken American politicians relatively hard to find? You can say pass. We will
So
get to the, yes, pass.
there are defenders, but most of the defenders are not necessarily politicians, but they are writers, intellectuals, New Deal writers and intellectuals, because this was done by Hoover and the Republican administration, and a lot of the New Dealers, or the people who will become New Dealers, see this as another version of the bad things that Hoover is doing, especially to minority groups. And so they're African American activists are much more cognizant of this, and so they also see this as well. And so those are the groups that see that. The other group is just business interests that are like, hey, we want our workers, we don't want them to leave. And so there's actually a surprising amount of Republican congressmen in Texas and in California who are against these deportations because they wanted to keep the labor.
Thank you so much. Finally, we'll close with a question from our colleague Saltanat Liebert, who asks, going back to the initial conversation, and I think a lot of us here who are not in your area are also asking ourselves, based on historical trends, do you anticipate that the anti-immigrant sentiment in the US will over time be replaced with a more liberal immigration climate? Or she doesn't ask this, but I'm asking, or what is your prediction, I guess?
I don't know. Um, as
Fair.
as a historian, I'm not very good at telling the future. I will say though that specific when the American people are asked specific policies about immigration, they are a lot more pro-immigrant than they are if they and they're just asked about immigrants in general. So they're
Mhm.
asked, should dreamers, which is to say people who came here as children and spent their whole lives here, should they be deported? They usually say no, they should be given a path to citizenship. When asked if people pay fines and wait a large number of years and be given a path to citizenship, there's support that comes in somewhere around 60 to 70% support. And that is the thing and that is actually what's labeled amnesty, but that's not amnesty. Actual amnesty was what Ronald Reagan did, which had lower barriers. But what congressional Democrats tried to do during the Biden administration, if you actually follow what they wanted, the American people actually tend to support that. The American people also do tend to think that immigrants bring in a lot of skills and jobs that are field jobs that the American people don't can't do or won't do. The and that's the thing that at the local level, people tend to be friendly to the Latinos around them or the immigrants around them. But at the national level, things get distorted. Things get distorted by media, things get distorted by political rhetoric. And I don't know what's going to win out. I like
Mhm.
to think um, that we will think about this and change. And we did. And there was a backlash, right? There was a backlash in 4 or 5 years ago against the first Trump administration. And I think there might be a similar one today, but I don't know. We'll see how this plays out.
To be determined. In the meantime, congratulations from all of us here and from your colleagues. I see the chat is full of congratulatory notes. This is all the time we have for questions. If you still have them, please address them directly to Professor Morales. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer. There was a recent VCU News article. And we still have the link, I think, in the chat if you'd like to get your copy.